and we'll open our phone lines to get your thoughts about that panel. Later, a discussion on memoirs and remembrances, including Congressman Charlie Rangel of Harlem and New York's 15th District. Along with him will be journalists Dominique Carter, A.Z. Faison, Yvonne Thornton, and June Cross. And that will be followed by a discussion on writing from an international perspective. After that, a panel on the politics of African American identity, including W.D. Wright, Gloria J. Brown Marshall, Paul Robeson Jr., and Carol Lee. And the final discussion will be on the evolution of grassroots political thought. Up next, Walter Mosley and Howard Zinn on American history. Howard Zinn, who wrote A People's History of the United States, 1492 to present, joined by Walter Mosley, who authored Devil in a Blue Dress, which was adapted into a movie starring Denzel Washington and Jennifer Beals. This is live coverage of the Harlem Book Fair on Book TV. Again, we're bringing you live day-long coverage from the Harlem Book Fair in the Schomburg Center in Harlem in New York. The next panel will feature authors Walter Mosley and Howard Zinn. They'll discuss American history, and we'll open our phone lines to get your thoughts after their discussion. A little bit about the fair. The book fair was founded in 1999, and it attracts more readers from the African-American community than any other event in the country. Approximately 50,000 people last year. The stated purpose of the book fair is to spread awareness of literature, culture, and African-American history. It features over 250 exhibit booths, 4 stages, celebrity authors, book selling, storytelling, and a variety of musical entertainment. It's hosted by the Black Book Review, and this year's fair is held again in the Schomburg Center and the County Cullen Libraries on West 135th Street and 5th Avenue to 7th Avenue. Walter Mosley on the left, Howard Zinn on the right on your screen. They'll be discussing African American history, and we're bringing you live coverage of the Harlem Book Fair here on Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
For a people's history of the United States, 1492 to the present. Fortunate son working on the chain gang, shaking off the dead hand of history, all of those topics and more. Please welcome A History of America, a conversation with Howard Zinn and Walter Mosley.
So here we are, huh? It's very funny, you know, like they kind of put us out on stage, and we met backstage.
They didn't tell us what to do.
No.
No.
But maybe that's good, huh?
Yeah, we don't like to follow orders anyway, do we?
That's right. I don't, anyway. I know that. So anyway, I'm going to start. I'm going to ask you a question. There's something I've been working on lately, and it actually started in this room. I was giving a talk, I don't know, like maybe 8 years ago, this auditorium, and I started talking about the vote. And a woman in the audience said very angrily to me that, man, I heard enough about the vote. When are we going to do something? Mm-hmm. You know, and I thought, wow, you know, she's right. And so I've been thinking lately, I've been thinking about, well, there's two things I've been thinking. I've been thinking about starting a website where people can download software in order to identify themselves as a special interest group, and then to find other people who agree with their interests, and then take that from the virtual world to the real world. The reason that I want to do it, and I want to see what you think about this, is it's my understanding that rather than living in a democracy, by default, we're living in a mostly benevolent oligarchy. Mm. What do you think?
Mostly I don't know how benevolent it is. Oligarchy, yes, benevolent? No. But, you know, this business of the vote is really important because we live in a culture, and you can see this by what television emphasizes, what the newspapers emphasize. Everything is built around the vote. Everything is built around who is going to be the next president. Because we all learn, as we're growing up in this country, the most important thing is who is president and who is in Congress. And what we should have learned by now, if we really learned history, or if we just looked around or thought about it, is that the president, Congress, the Supreme Court, they get all the attention. But the fact is, we cannot depend on them to bring about a state of justice and equality in this country. It is up to us. That's why what you're saying about the internet and bringing people together, grassroots groups, making connections, I mean, that's democracy.
Right.
But, you know, you go to junior high school and they teach you what democracy is, and they put on the board the 3 branches of government, and they talk about checks and balances. And no, that's not democracy.
Right. I mean, it's one kind of very bureaucratic, like, wing of democracy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's, you know, democracy is what people do for themselves. And if you look through history, what you find is that where we've had really serious problems to solve, they haven't been solved by the president or by Congress or by the Supreme Court. The president and Congress and the Supreme Court, they react to the social movements that exist in the country. And so, I mean, slavery was not simply abolished because Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation.
Right,
I mean, exactly. His Emancipation Proclamation came after 30 years of grassroots agitation by black people and some white people, you know, who were creating a great movement. And we've seen that more recently, right? We couldn't depend on even the so-called liberal presidents, Johnson, Kennedy, to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments. And what happened? Black people had to go out in the streets and all over the South and risk their lives in order to make sure that the 14th and 15th Amendments were finally enforced.
Yeah.
So, you know, the idea of, they've bamboozled us with the idea of, you know, the voting is the most important thing we can do.
And it's like one thing that you do one day every 4 years or so. And then that there's a lot more to do in between, and there's a lot more to understand. But one of the things, at least for me, that's so confusing, it's a lot of people say, well, they'll come to me and they'll say, well, people don't know this. People don't know that their vote doesn't count, or people don't know that they're being bamboozled, that they're being fooled. But it seems to me like people do know. It seems to me that most people I talk to, and I'm not just talking about New York, you know, because that can get very strange. But even like, you know, like I'll be in the Midwest and I'll be talking, you know, to some, you know, old guy out there, and they'll explain to me how their medical insurance isn't working, how their retirement isn't working, how their children are making the exact same salary that they were making 20 years ago. And so knowledge alone doesn't seem to create enough of an impetus to change things.
Yeah. I think you're right about people knowing, you know, well, you can tell that people know the inadequacy of voting by the fact that half the people in the country don't vote in presidential elections. Why don't they vote? Because they, I think, don't believe that the voting is going to mean anything. And even the 50% of people who do vote, well, we know this, they vote without enthusiasm.
Yeah.
Because what choice do they have? You know, and you know, I once saw a bumper sticker that said, if God had intended us to vote, he would have given us candidates. No. So people know this. People know a lot. You see, it's amazing. It's amazing that people know as much as they do, considering the fact that the media, television, newspapers do their best to keep people ignorant. And our educational system doesn't do a lot to give people their real history, and yet people, you know, are intelligent and have common. But the question is, and this is the question you raised, I think, they know these things, and yet very often that knowledge isn't transformed into action. And I think the reason for that is that people very often don't know their own power. And this is where history, they feel helpless. They know these things, but they don't know what to do about it. And it's only at certain points in history that people learn how much power they have. You know, well, I'm thinking of the South, you know, where I lived with my family in the years of the movement, you know, in the late 50s and early 60s. I'm thinking of the South. And black people knew what their lives were like, but it took a while for them to transform that knowledge into this fantastic movement.
And that movement was comprised very greatly of young people, right?
It was.
And that you know, because one of the problems I have today, I'll talk to somebody and I'll say, I'll make a suggestion. I'll say, well, why don't you get this young woman or this young guy to lead your organization? They say, well, they're only 27. And I said, well, you know, that's how Martin Luther King was when they did the boycott. I said, well, he was different. They don't make people like him anymore. You know, there's that kind of, but that's a self-defeating notion, right? Like and that becomes a part of it. And another thing, like another step beyond that I think is connected to that. I'll say to somebody, they say, well, who are you voting for? And I said, well, you know, who I vote for doesn't matter. How I vote and how I identify myself matters. And then they don't hear that. And they say, well, I like Barack Obama, let's say. You know, or Hillary Clinton or Rudy Giuliani. I don't know who they say. But they say somebody. And they say, let's say they say Barack. And they say, I like him. And I said, well, do you know him? Like, and they go, well, yeah, I know what he stands for. I said, well, you thought you knew what Clinton stands for, right? And, you know, I know he lived in Harlem and everything, but you thought you knew that, and you were wrong. And you understand what I'm trying to say? There's a question of there's some knowledge that we believe that we have that we don't really have. I like people have, like, you know, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and all these people. They're like rock stars, but we don't know them.
Yeah. And you know, you were talking about young people, Walter. Yeah. And what I find is I talk a lot, and probably you do too, to high school kids. And I find these high school kids are very often way ahead of the adults who write for the New York Times or who are the anchors on television. They have certain instincts about things. And one of the reasons that all these books are up here, right?
Yeah, right.
You put
Howard's
them there.
books for young people. Yeah, I did.
You put them there.
Yes,
Thanks so much.
It's my fault.
But
it's my fault he wrote them, you know? No.
But one of the reasons for writing for young people is because young people do not get a kind of history that empowers them.
Yeah.
And the young people, they get, the heroes they get are the presidents and the industrialists and the military heroes, especially the military heroes, to prepare these young people for the next recruiting officer who comes into high school. But no, we want young people to have as their heroes the people in the anti-slavery movement, the people who led working people, the labor organizers, the Cesar Chavez, the boycotters. We want them to learn about the anti-war people, about those who protested our various wars. We want them to learn about socialists and anarchists and dissenters, the kind of people you don't read about in history.
Like Thomas Paine, who somehow gets left out of history, but it's such an important figure. It says, I'm a revolutionary, not a guy who follows the rules.
Yeah, absolutely. So we need new sets of heroes for young people, not Christopher Columbus and not Theodore Roosevelt and not Andrew Jackson. We need Fannie Lou Hamer and Bob Moses. I mean, the right Bob Moses, not, right?
Or the left one.
Or the left one.
But part of the problem is, of course, I mean, or what seems to me a problem is that you came up in a time, and you were very politically active in a time. Not that you aren't still politically active, but talking about those earlier days, where young people were a part of the movement. Young people were, at least to some degree, respected. Young people were allowed, or in some way made their own way along with their elders to kind of pull us along, to push us further. And that's really not true today. It's very, it's really not true a lot, even like in places like the black community, where young people seem to be denigrated a lot.
Well, I won't speak for the black community.
You won't?
I know white people speak for the black community all the time. Yeah. So why shouldn't I, right? But no, I won't.
Okay.
I won't. But I see when I go to anti-war vigils and anti-war demonstrations, when a few years ago I went to one of these great demonstrations of people who were demonstrating for the rights of immigrants, a lot of Latino people, but other people. I see a lot of young people in these demonstrations.
I think that there is a lot of activity. Yeah. But at the top, there's a lot of people who kind of have keeping their positions. I won't name anybody because, I might be in trouble. But I think that there are a lot of people who maintain their position. And at the same time, I think this is not necessarily historical, but it's one of the ways I think that you go about thinking about history. Like I'll be talking to somebody and they'll start talking to me about hip hop people, and they'll say it's hip hop's hip hop caused Don Imus to say bad things about black basketball players, and I'm saying, so you mean it's hip hop's problem that there's racism? And they go, yeah, well, no, but, I always say this when people interview me, and the interviews never make it into the news, they never make it in the newspapers, but I'll say, well, the reason that people are using this language is the prisons. Hip-hop, it's another kind of protest movement. Instead of coming out of slavery, it's coming out of the prisons. It's language, it's thoughts and ideas, self-deprecations, etc., that come out of prison. And I say to people, I say, if you want people to stop using this language, you should do something about the prisons. But this becomes too big a thing. They say, oh no, I just want them to stop using the language. Just say, stop saying bitches and hoes and I'll be fine. You know, and
You know, Walter, I'm glad you brought up prisons, because we have in this country now over 2 million people in prisons. I mean, this is the largest rate of incarceration of any place in the world.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of really bad places in the world. And so when you think of the fact that some people are offended when you say that, you know, this isn't the great society that we grew up thinking we were.
Yeah.
There are many signs that we're not the greatest society. We have troops in 100 different countries in the world, military bases. We are selling arms to countries all over the world. We have 40 million people without health care, and we have 2 million people in prison.
Yeah.
There's something sick about a society that has 2 million people in prison. And the 2 million people in prison have something to do with wealth and poverty, and with the way the wealth of this country is being squandered into military ventures and given to the super rich. And the result of this gap between rich and poor is you get all these people in prison.
And this, another thing, which, you know, this is just kind of one of my personal things. I'm looking at people in prison, and you look at a town, let's say some little town, let's say it's a white town in the Midwest, and they say, we're not doing so well, so we'll build a prison. They want us to build a prison, so we'll build a prison. And they build a prison, and they put, like, you know, 7,000 people in the prison, most of whom are people of color, you know, or poor white people are just crazy. And they have them in prison, you know, because Reagan, you know, closed all the mental institutions, you know, and anyway, so we have all these people in prison, and the last time the census counted, there was like 5,000 people. Now this time the census come around, and they say there's 12,000 people. And they get all the benefits. They get the tax benefits. They get the electoral benefits in their own area and also nationally. But still, they won't let people in prison vote.
Well, it's interesting. That's right. There are millions of votes that are uncounted.
Yeah.
Now, why shouldn't prisoners have a right to vote? They're human beings.
Exactly. They're an American human beings.
And
yeah.
not only that, they're smart.
Yeah. And they have a lot of time to think about it.
They have a lot of time to think about it. They read. They read a lot of books, you know.
Yeah.
And yeah, they should be voting. I mean, one of the shameful things about the election of 2000, and it's true of all of these elections, but we saw it especially 2000, all these people were not allowed to vote in Florida, right? Thousands and thousands of people were not allowed to vote in Florida because of their prison records.
Right.
Of course, in some cases, it was even faked, their prison records.
But they were going to go to prison.
That's right. They thought they might go to prison someday, so they shouldn't vote, right?
You're black, you live in Miami, you're going to prison.
Yeah. And no, I correspond with several, you probably do too, because, you know, if you want to...
He includes me in everything, you know. I don't do anything good. He does everything good, but he includes me, and I'm silent.
No, because I just know you do these things. Because I'm sure that people read your books in prison, and they write to you, right? And you write back. So correspond with people in prison. And I very often have the feeling that any one of these prisoners that I write to would make a better president than the one we have in the White House, you see.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
You know.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, really. And here they are.
Oh, absolutely. There's no question about that. And your number, I mean, I don't want to, like, correct you because, you know, you're Howard Zinn, and so it's hard, you know, I don't want to correct you. But the number 2 million is a way low number, right? There's really like 6 million. There's like the 2 million that are coming back. There's the 2 million or 3 million that are out who may be going back or may not be going back. And a great many of them can't vote, and a great many of them are stigmatized. And like, you know, if you can't vote in America, if you don't have the right to vote in America, that means it's like taking away your citizenship. It's like, and it's certainly taking away the power of all these poor and communities of color who have no possibility for representation or thought. And it's hard. I can't even talk on a liberal, I get on liberal stations, and they're okay when I say people who come out of prison can vote. But when I say prisoners can vote, they say, well, that's too much, Mr. Mortensen. That's too much. And I go, why? I said, well, I don't want a rapist voting. And I'm saying, you think everybody in prison is a rapist? They said, well, or a murderer. I said, well, what about the people who write bad checks? Why can't they vote? You know, I mean, it's really
people who write bad checks are pretty smart. Yeah.
Yeah.
They would,
better not than me. I can't do it. I tried.
Yeah, they would make good choices. Yes, definitely.
I said, Howard Zinn.
Yeah.
$1 million.
By the way, Walt, I don't know if I said this. We just met today, actually, for the first time. We should have met a long time ago, like when we were 5 years old, but we just met today. And but I've been reading Walter Mosley's books for years. And you know, I mean, you don't write history books, but the people you write about are the people who are left out in history. You know, right? The people on the street, the people, Easy Rawlins is a person who represents a whole culture, and he has to be listened to. He should be listened to. If people listen to him, you know, we might have a different country in a different world.
Well, thank you. I mean, thank you very much. It is true that it's hard to find in any kind of central system in our government people who pay attention to everyday people. Like, you know, I think that your history, of course, you know, talks about, well, how everyday people experienced history, how all those people who were ignored experienced history, and you know, also bring out the lies of history. So I mean, because like women couldn't vote until 1920. I mean, like, so were they living in a democracy, and you know, in America all this time? But it's very difficult. It's difficult. It's not difficult to do, I think, because I think you and myself also naturally think about working people and working class people and everyday people, but it's hard to get that to, you know, it doesn't seem sexy. You know what I mean? I think one of the problems, it doesn't seem sexy, and also it doesn't support the super rich, as you say.
You're not supposed to mention the super rich.
Yeah.
But what I was thinking about, say, is that as you were talking, and as I was talking, I was thinking, what are we doing? We're being very critical, right?
Yeah.
And we're saying we don't really have a democracy.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, right, you called it an oligarchy, adding a little benevolence. But people, very often, people listening to us saying, what? We're not a democracy?
Yeah.
No. Why are you putting us down? America is the greatest country in the world. You hear this again and again. You mustn't criticize because we are the greatest country in the world, because everybody pledges allegiance to the flag by the time, you know, they're 1 foot high, and they're singing the Star-Spangled Banner, liberty and justice for all, and all of that. And so when they hear somebody say, you know, we're not really a democracy, or there are few very, very powerful, rich people who are at the top and in control of society, they think you're being unpatriotic.
Yeah.
And they use that word unpatriotic, and they forget what patriotism really is. That patriotism is love of your country. Yeah. It's not love of your government. There's a difference between the government and the country.
You mean I don't have to love George Bush? Wow.
Come to think of it, you don't.
That's really good. You know? I like that.
And you know, you see the television cameras focus on young men in uniform going off to Iraq, and sometimes they'll say, and tell me, young man, why did you enlist? And he, or a young woman, they'll say, well, because I believe I owe something to my country. I want to fight for my country. They've been deluded. They're not going to fight for their country. They're going to fight for Bush and Cheney and Halliburton. They're going to fight for the corporations that make profit out of war. You know, the country doesn't need war. The country doesn't need to spend this huge, huge sums of money, trillions of dollars on war. The country needs to take care of people here and to take care of people elsewhere. That's the country. And I think when the government acts against the interests of the country,
we should tear it down. I mean, there's no
I was
question.
hoping you would say something like that.
No. It should be torn. I mean, I love it that was it Cindy Sheehan, right? Has said that if Pelosi doesn't vote to try to impeach Bush, that she's going to run against her. That's democracy. Say, you're not doing what I want, so I'm going to run against you and see if the people agree with me or if the people agree with you. And in San Francisco, I'm sure they're going to agree with Sheehan. So that would be really great. And I think that to say that we need to tear the government down is not a bad thing. The government, because the government doesn't represent us.
Well, when you say tear the government down, I mean, the writers of the Declaration of Independence didn't use those exact words, but they said basically the same thing, because in the Declaration of Independence, which, by the way, the leaders of our government really don't want us to read very carefully. The Declaration of Independence says that when governments become destructive of the rights of equality and life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, when governments become destructive of those, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish the government.
Yeah.
And, and certainly right now, it is our right to impeach the president and vice president of the United States.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's no question that we have the right and that we should, but there's also no question that we feel helpless, even though we, and I mean not just the people in this audience, but we are in the majority, which is an interesting moment how democracy has turned in, or oligarchy pretending it's a democracy because it allows us to vote for either the Democrat or the Republican, which is like a crazy notion. It's like, those are my two choices. I'm looking at these people, I said, there's all kinds of people I know. It's like you say, I know people on my block who would be a better president than anybody running. It's like, and it's like, and they might not be the best president. And I think it's really, and one of my issues is getting people to know it, because in this thing that I want to do, downloading the thing so people can start into interest groups, I'm thinking, well, listen, it doesn't matter, like if you're a black nationalist or you're in the Aryan Brotherhood or it doesn't matter what kind of religion you are, or if you're conservative or liberal or radical or whatever, reactionary. I think everybody in America wants medical care, a living wage, a place to live, and the ability to age with dignity. I think everybody. I mean, I don't know anybody who would say, I don't want that. I don't want medical care, man. What do you think I am? Some kind of wimp?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it seems to me that democracy naturally would lead toward giving those things. And for some reason, it's leading away from it.
Well, we may be at that point in history where the American colonists were on the eve of the American Revolution. I'm serious about that.
All right.
And that is that they were at a point where the people in charge, the people who were the officials of the British government, were not taking care of people's needs. In fact, were oppressing them, were taxing them, and what did they do? They couldn't depend on these institutions, and so they created the grassroots movements. They had committees of correspondence, and these committees were meeting all over the country. And all through the colonies.
And pamphleteers.
Pamphleteers, right? The poets, the writers, Tom Paine. And it seems to me, if the leaders of Congress, the Democrats, who are now, even with a slim majority, have a majority, if they are not willing to act on impeachment, which is what we really need now, because we don't want to wait for the next election. We want to get rid of the people in the White House right now, you see. And if the Democrats are not going to do it, then we need something like the committees of correspondence. That is, we need community groups, town meetings to take place, neighborhood meetings take place all over the country with people demanding impeachment. And, to create a national movement which then might scare Congress into acting, because Congress is easily scared.
Well, but I mean, one of the things is when we're looking at democratic history, you could say not very far. I mean, not real history. I mean, history that we can remember, but still, it happened a while ago. At one time, the Democrats were supported by labor, and the Republicans were supported by the super rich. Okay, you know, I mean, that's not perfect, but it's okay, you know. I mean, at least it's two different sides. But, you know, Reagan pretty much got rid of the unions. The unions are a very small amount of Americans today. American workers are unionized, and most of them are retired. Then, because of that, the Democrats and the Republicans are supported by the same group of people, right? I mean, so like the Democrats are sitting there in office, they're not helping us, but there's a reason they're not helping us. It's because, you know, Halliburton doesn't just give to Republicans. You know, Mobil Oil and Bank of America and Pfizer and, you know, I mean, and like Walmart and all these other people, they don't just give to the Republicans. They give to the Democrats too. They're all owned by the same people.
You know, I once figured out that when the Republicans have a fundraising dinner, they will charge $400,000 for somebody to attend the fundraising dinner. The Democrats are different. They will only charge $300,000.
Exactly.
You know.
They're liberals.
Yeah, they're liberals. Yeah, and if what's interesting to me is that when they pass the military budget, everybody, Democrat and Republican, vote for the military budget. We just passed the largest military budget in history, over $500 billion. Damn. Unanimously voted by both Republicans and Democrats. And this is shocking.
It's not unanimous, right? A couple of people voted against it, didn't they?
Well, not actually on the military budget, but there are a couple of good people in Congress who have voted against war resolutions or voted against the Patriot Act. I mean, I think of Barbara Lee in California.
She was wonderful.
You know, right after 9/11, and they passed the resolution giving Bush the authority to go to war, Barbara Lee was the only person in Congress to speak up against that. That was courage. And there are a few people now in Congress speaking up. John Lewis, I heard John Lewis, you know, comes out of that movement in the South. John Lewis delivered an impassioned speech on the floor of the House calling for the withdrawal of our troops from Iraq. Of course, it got no coverage. It got no coverage in the press, and it wasn't picked up by, you know, the other people, the other Democrats in Congress. So there, you know, there are a few people.
And then just for a moment, the negative space. The positive space, let's say, is the United States, the borders of the United States. The negative space is international policy. I mean, I don't know very many people in America who know anything about the theory behind our foreign policy. It leads me to think that corporations make up completely our foreign policy. Am I wrong about that?
Well, I think you're like 98% right. Because I never want to concede.
Because he knows something about it. Oh,
I never want to concede that anybody is 100% right.
Oh,
so,
okay.
no.
Well, that's good.
But
I'm not going to take your class.
But it's interesting that when they teach courses, and this is what I know about because I was in departments of political science, so they taught courses in international relations. There were all sorts of courses in international relations. And in those courses in international relations, there was virtually nothing about the role of rich corporations in influencing and directing foreign policy. But, I mean, there's no question about it, that our foreign policy, and this is where history comes in handy. You go way back. The military ventures of the United States, the interventions of the United States, have always had an economic motive behind them. With the Mexican War in 1846, the motive was land. With the Spanish-American War in 1898, the motive was the raw materials of Cuba. Same thing true with the Philippines. And with the Vietnam War, there were economic motives, the tin, rubber, oil in Southeast Asia. And of course, right now with Iraq, the economic motive is clear, although they want to talk about it, oil. They talk about democracy and building, you know, which is nonsense. Imagine the Bush administration going to bring democracy to anybody. I mean, that...
Well, they should bring it here first. I mean, I'd like to have some.
Yeah, at least a little of it,
Like my new Harry Potter book, you know, I'd be waiting online with something around my wrist to say, give me some democracy, please.
Yeah.
You know, we're sitting in Harlem, you know, and we're addressing an audience in Harlem. And so, like, and I know you don't speak for black people, but I put you on the spot with a question. Because, you know, it's something that I've been thinking about lately. And I began to bring it up with talking about young people, you know, because young people in America think a lot differently at this moment, at this juncture, than previous generations, and they're thinking in new ways and going in new ways. Black people, like for instance, if you're in film, anybody who's in film knows that if make a film, and even if there's all black people, and never call it a black film, because you're not going to sell that film in Europe, you're not going to sell that film in Asia, you're not going to sell that film in South America. There's a notion about black people that we've become, even though at one point we were leading the world fighting for freedom, now it's become a kind of, we're seen as kind of parochial in a way, on an international level, and a lot internal. And I believe, when I was in my house watching the planes crash in the World Trade Center, some years ago, and after I got off the phone, after I got, for the next 3-4 months, people called me, and maybe 2,000 people called me, or I called them. Half of them were black people, half of them were white people. The one thing that all black people had in common was none of them were surprised about the attacks. I didn't talk to one black person, not one. Since then I've talked to one, but that was the only one who was shocked by the attack, that other people would hate us so much, that they would attack. They didn't necessarily like it, they might have been afraid, they might have been patriotic, they might have joined the army, I don't know what they did, but they weren't surprised. They said, well, yeah, you had to know that was going to happen. Didn't they try to blow it up just a few years before that? And of course you say, yeah, that's true. You think that somebody would think about that, but they were still surprised. And I'm wondering, especially sitting in Harlem, addressing a primarily black audience here, that is there a way that we have to refigure ourselves in order to deal with this changing world?
It's interesting that black people, as you suggested in their reaction to 9/11, black people have generally been more perceptive about the United States and what it's doing in the world, what it's doing to the world, for obvious reasons, because whatever the United States has been doing to the world, whether we were sending Marines into Central America or sending armies into Southeast Asia or now into, or whatever the reasons, the United States was always saying, we're doing this for democracy. And black people in this country, would,
I want some
do
of
what
that.
you're doing. They would laugh at this. You're doing this for democracy,
right.
And in fact, when they take polls of, anti-war attitudes, it's always clear. The largest anti-war attitudes are always among the black population. They know. So they're the ones we should talk to first if we want to find out what's going on. But I think they have a better connection with the rest of the world. They're more honest about who we are and what we are. And I think the reason for talking to young people and the reason for giving young people a different kind of history, is that we should be honest with young people. Very often they think young people, oh, well, they need fairy tales. They don't, we should shield them from the reality of what we have done in the world. No, we shouldn't shield them. We shouldn't protect them. We have to be honest if we want to face ourselves. And it's been easier for black people to be honest about what we've done.
No, because we see the real America. It's like, it's pretty easy when they say, no, you can't vote, and no, you can't have this job. No, you can't be in this place. Or, it happens again and again, over and over again. And it becomes a problem. Even in the most liberal institutions, you find a whole bunch of white people up in there, and you're saying, well, wow. But at the same time, now, and really, I'm saying this for the audience, and I need you to agree with it because I know you'd be uncomfortable agreeing with it. Nobody knows how to act like a white person better than black people.
Because you've studied us.
We've studied you our whole lives. I've been watching you, man. I got that. I can do that. Oh, no. It's like, and so here we are, extremely powerful in our knowledge, but unable, it seems to me, for instance, we talk about black people voting, black people in prison voting. Every black person in America should tell the next candidate, if we don't have our black men and women in prison voting, we ain't gonna vote for you. We shouldn't be Democrats or Republicans. We should have the interest of our own people in mind, and we don't. Ruby Dee, who I was on the stage with last night, was sitting in front of a giant audience of black people, and she asked people, do you know why the movie Beloved didn't work? And it's a giant, everybody's looking at her, and she said, because you didn't go to it on the first week. And, she was right about 90% of the people in the room, It's like, they went to see, Die Hard or whatever was playing, and they didn't go see Beloved. There's all this power that we have, and there's all this knowledge that we have, but there's something stopping that, right?
But it's interesting about power. People don't know their own power because the people who seem to have power, well, I suppose they don't just seem to have power, they do have the power. They have the power to take our wealth. They have the power to send people to die overseas. They have the power. And yet, they're really not all powerful because their power depends on everybody else's obedience.
Exactly.
If people stopped obeying, they would not have power. You were talking about, if people went to see Beloved, okay, people have buying power.
Right.
Cesar Chavez recognized that. We have the power of the boycott. I remember when Jesse Jackson announced that he might start a boycott of Texaco because of Texaco's racial policies. As soon as that was announced in the press, Texaco immediately said, oh, we're changing, right? The boycott is a very powerful thing. If people use the boycott, their buying power, if young people refuse to go into the military, they depend on the military for their wars. They can't fight wars without young people going to it.
But now can I jump in on this a minute? Because this is one thing that seems very obvious to me, but I haven't really read it. Bush, it's not really President Bush, it's really President Cheney. President Cheney President Cheney has done a really brilliant thing. He supports the super rich, he helps the super rich have more and more garnered their power. We have dollars, they have euros, we have dollars, they have yens, it's like, and so he's made a whole bunch of the underclass declared a war, but didn't declare a draft. So no, you don't. I mean, the people are saying, because you're saying that people are saying they're going because they're patriotic, which is true. But my cynical side says, they also promised them, I'm going to give you $50,000.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to give you an education. Yeah. I'm going to make sure that your children will be, you're living in luxury. And of course, they're not going to give them any of that.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody I knew joined. They're saying, I'm still trying to fight for that $10,000 they promised me, but they ain't sent it yet. But I'm gonna figure it out.
Yeah.
But the thing is that there's no. I mean, they've made a lower class, and men and women can join, and so they can fill up the army without a draft.
But they're having more trouble doing it now. The truth gets through. It takes a while for the truth to get past the media and the power of the government. But I guess proof that the truth is getting through is the numbers of people who more and more and more are opposed to the war, despite the fact that they've been misled by the press and the media. Mm-hmm. And so there is a truth that gets through, and it gets through over time, and so they're having trouble meeting their recruiting quotas, even with all the money that they're offering, all the bonuses that they're offering,
well, they don't
all the lies they're telling.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a good sign.
It is, except for if people got more poor, which it kind of is, it's not unlikely, especially if you pay rent in Manhattan. I don't know how many people still do, but it's like the idea is that if you can make somebody hungry enough, if you get out of high school, you get out of college, and you can't get a job, and then the Army offers you anything, so well, at least they give me a place to sleep.
Yeah.
Sure, I mean,
Yeah.
Army might be able to go back and say, we'll give you a place to sleep. And then, you know, we know you're kind of frustrated, so we let you kill some people too, you know, I mean.
Yeah.
And I understand your side, you know, I mean, you're very optimistic, and I read the thing you wrote in 2004 about optimism, and you know, and I'm an optimistic person, I like it, but there's a whole system against us, especially, you know, poor black people, poor Hispanic people, and poor white people, they do exist, you know, there doesn't seem to be a way out. And still, this moment of helplessness, you know, invades. And you know, and I know I keep getting back to it, but you know, it seems to me so important, you know, like, you know, because I ask people, I don't ask people why we're fighting Iraq. I just ask who. Who are we fighting?
Yeah.
You know, and they say, well, we're the enemy. I said, but they're our friends. We're giving them democracy, and we're killing them at the same time. I don't get it. And you know, and I think most people. Nobody answers my question when I ask them who we're fighting. They say, well, we point a gun at somebody, and if he pulls out a gun, we know he's the enemy. You know, I mean.
Yeah. Yeah. But look, that's why we're here, right?
Yeah.
That's why you and I are here. That's why these people are here. That's why there are more and more people in this country who are learning and who are getting at the truth. And the problem is to convert the knowledge that more and more people are having. And it's obvious that, well, look, how many people believe in Bush anymore in this country? a minority of people believe in Bush and Cheney anymore. Most people have gotten wise to them. The problem is converting this knowledge into action.
But
organizing and acting.
But most people in America think the action is to elect, you know, Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's a problem because, you know, they're not going to, I mean, you see that picture of Hillary and Clinton, you remember that like 3 months ago? There's Hillary, there's Barack, and they got $26 million next to Hillary's name, and $25 million, you know, and it's not a bounty or anything. It's how much money somebody gave them. And I talk to people, they say, oh, did you see how much money Barack got? I said, well, but they bought him with that money, right? And they look at me like, no, they bought him. You know, you know, nobody give you $25 million for nothing. You know, so so Bush can't even run anymore. So you know, but even if there is the Democrat you like, you know, let's say like the Democrat everybody likes, Al Gore, you know, gets, you know, elected president, is that really going to make the difference?
You know, elections don't do it. Social movements do it.
Yeah.
And this is what people have to learn. No matter who is elected president, we've got to have a people's movement in this country. Yeah. We have to have the kinds of things that happened in the 60s. We have to have the people all over the country. We have the kind of things that happened in the South. Look, people in the South did not have a president in the White House. Even when it was Kennedy or Johnson, they did not have a president in the White House who was going to change things. And people in the South learned, black people in the South learned that they had to do it themselves. And they created a movement which galvanized the South. And we need a movement like that in this country.
And do you see, like, and for the audience, and you know, for the, you know, people watching this place, by the way, do you see a place to grab on in order to begin this movement? Because, you know, you can see, you know, in the South, in the 50s and the 60s, how people identified with each other. You know, pressed into neighborhoods, being robbed of their rights and their wealth and their ability, stuff like that. People today, a lot don't feel that. They feel, you know, I always like to say that America's religion is capitalism, you know, which is why people would never admit being poor. You know, 80% of the country is working class, and 80% of the country says they're middle class. You know, you don't even understand it. You know, say, you know, I mean, because you know the difference between a working class person, middle class person is this: a middle class person, if they lose their job, they don't have to get another job for about a year. They can live at the same level, give to the same charities, go to the same clubs, kids stay in the same schools. A working class person, they lose their job, they got to get another job in 2 weeks, or their whole life changes. You know, that's most of America, right? You know, but people they don't want to identify with that. They want to identify with being middle class, and so they don't seem ready to move. You know, we got 1 million black people in prison, 2 million black people either going in or coming out of prison. We don't have a movement about that.
Well, it's time for a movement, right? It's time for a new movement.
Howard Zinn says so.
And we've gone through other periods in American history where it didn't seem like anything was happening, and where things were going on.
Yeah.
And movements build up, you know, the movements build up over time. And, you know, in the 1830s, the movement against slavery was tiny. And then it grew and grew. And you have to have a certain confidence, you know. And in the South, in the 1950s and 1960s, it looked impossible. I mean, right? And the federal government wasn't doing anything. And the Southern governments were completely, and the police and everything, in the hands of white supremacists. So I think you have to start somewhere. You have to have the faith that if you start and do something, that somebody else in the next community will do something, somebody on the other side of the country will do something. And you have to have the faith that if you act, in the smallest act of rebellion, that at some point you will be joined by others. I mean, that's how things have happened in this country historically. It hasn't happened because of Congress or the Supreme Court or the president. It's happened, you know, a labor movement was created and people went on strike and people stopped the machinery of industry. A movement took place in the South and people just galvanized the country by what they were doing. You know, we obviously are in need of a new national movement because this is a very rich country. The wealth has been concentrated in a very small number of hands.
And always has been. And always has been.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it's time to change that.
Yeah.
And it's time to change the image of America from a marauder in the world to being a decent citizen in the world, which means remove our troops from other countries, right? Starting with Iraq, but remove our troops from everywhere and use the immense wealth of this country to give everybody free health care and whatever it is people need to live a decent life. And we can't depend on Congress or the Supreme Court or the president. We can only depend on ourselves. And we have to start wherever we are. Get together with your neighbors, get together in your community.
Yeah.
I mean, this is how change has taken place in history. The civil rights movement did it that way. The labor movement did it that way. The women's movement did it that way. And we're going to have to do it today ourselves. We're going to have to organize. We're going to have to take action. We're going to have to commit civil disobedience. We're going to have to stop the machinery of government, the machinery of war.
It would make sense to stop paying taxes, wouldn't it? I mean, I hate saying that, especially, with President Cheney watching television and everything. But it does. I mean, all these taxes that don't go to support us and do go to killing. Really, like the war is bad for us, but it's not nearly as bad for us as those people in Iraq, man. I mean, my God, I think of how those people live, and that's not even the worst place in the world. I mean, there's a lot worse places. Thousands of children die every day from bad water, and not even Gore talks about that. It's really problematic. But there's another thing, and I know, like, you're a historian, but being a historian, you have predictive powers, right? Because the more you know about what's happened, the more you can at least hopefully think about the future. Not exactly, but in ways. It seems to me that what we're doing with Iran right now is crazy, even if I accepted the terms of President Cheney. That he's saying, well, they're making, like, nuclear weapons, and because they're making nuclear weapons, we're going to have to attack them and blow them up. Now, that logic kind of made sense in 1950. You know what I mean? In the 20th century. In the 21st century, even a tiny little country like Luxembourg can make weapons of mass destruction. You don't need a nuclear weapon, you just need a germ. It could be like, this tiny little thing, you can't see it. Just like, well, you bring the germ over. You want to be like a suicide terrorist, bring the germ over, and we could wipe out Baltimore. I mean, it's like, we need to make peace because the way that we've done our international relations, this kind of, blowing up people, it's not going to work anymore.
Well, it's not working in Iraq.
Right.
It isn't working in Afghanistan. We need to become a different kind of country.
Yeah.
We need to stop being a war-making country. We need to stop having military bases all over the world. We need to stop spending $500, $600 billion a year on war.
My God.
And I mean, think what we could do with the wealth of this country if we could draw that wealth from two things, from the military budget and from the wealth of the super rich, who've been getting richer and richer and richer because of the tax system and because of the military contracts that they get. So this is a very rich country. We could take care of our people here. We could take care and help people abroad. But we need a new social movement in this country. We need a movement which will combine the energy of the labor movement of the 30s and the civil rights movement of the 60s and the women's movement of the 70s. We need a new social movement. And we have the basis for it because people are learning. They're just not organized yet, you know. And it's a matter of taking the new understanding that people are getting and beginning to organize all over the country and creating a new social movement. Because we're not going to be able, you're right, we're not going to be able to depend on whoever is president in the White House. Even if we get a better president in the White House.
We couldn't get a worse one.
No, we couldn't get worse.
So, I mean,
so it has to be better.
We're definitely going to have a better one. But
it has to be, well, we can have a better president.
But will they be good enough?
We could have a better president if we just had a lottery in this room. And right, we'd have a better president. There's no question. Well, a lottery out on the street.
You could just throw like a
exactly
a penny, and whoever gets hit in the head with the penny
exactly.
could be president.
But we do need a new social movement in this country, and because that's the only way we're going to bring about change. And in order to have a new social movement, people need to become aware of the history of social movements, because people need to become aware of their own power. People feel powerless, and people have to become aware, and this is where history comes in handy. The history of the labor movement, of the anti-slavery movement, people become aware that it is possible for ordinary people, when they organize in large enough numbers, to change history. We don't have to depend on Congress and the President and the Supreme Court, depend on ourselves. And historically, when you see that has happened in the past, then you learn that you can do it in the present. So, you know, we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's an interesting thing how white America begins to reflect black America, which I find so interesting here. Because, you know, we were robbed of our history from the get-go, right? They brought us over on the boats. They said, okay, everybody who speaks a different language will go, you know, we'll separate them all out so nobody can talk to each other and they can't plot and everything like that. And now that's been done to everybody in America. All of America has been robbed of their history. They don't know their history, you know, and at least we know we don't know our history. Other people think they know a history which is fake. You know, it's not a true history, which I think is one of the great things about, you know, a wonderful historian like you who wants to talk not about the rich man's history, not about the general's history, but the history of the people who either made changes or suffered the changes. But you think we should answer some questions from the audience?
Oh, yeah. You think, yeah.
Because Howard has to go back to Boston.
We just realized we have an audience, and you deserve the right to speak up. Right.
If you want to ask a question, there's a microphone over there, I think. Is that right, T?
Right here.
How do you spell T?
Huh? T-E. Okay, Walter. Anyone like to ask a question? Please come over here. We're doing Q&A, question and answer.
Thank you, Howard. It was lots of fun to talk to you. I really enjoyed talking to you. And I'm definitely going to come up to Boston and visit.
Will you?
Yeah.
That'd be great.
How are you?
Hello.
You spoke on a couple of topics that touched me, but most of the people in this country are not aware of how the World Bank sends in economic hitmen to take over other countries. They want their countries to fail. Would you address that, please?
Sir.
Thank you. Walter is very generous, turning over these tough questions to me. Yeah. You know, the World Bank, the International, Monetary Fund, these great world financial institutions have been dominated by the rich powers, especially by the United States. and they have therefore used their power over the money and used their power over the poor countries of the world to really distort the economies of these countries and basically to keep them poor and to add to their debt, being willing to give them money for certain reasons but not for other reasons. So what's happening, however, and this is encouraging, that there are some places in the world that are beginning to defy the World Bank and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and to defy them. You know, I'm thinking of these countries in Latin America, you know, which are freeing themselves from the control of the big financial institutions dominated by the United States. You know, I mean, Venezuela is an example. Venezuela is in the position to do it because they have all this oil. But I think this is going to happen more and more. And more poor countries are going to find ways to escape the power of the World Bank and the IMF. And no, this will mean more economic democracy in the world. And part of that campaign worldwide is for the American people to learn more about how the United States, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund are keeping people poor around the world, and how we have to play our part in changing our own economic structure and our own economic system so that the United States no longer plays the kind of exploiting role that it has played in the world. So we have a certain role to play in helping people in other countries.
And just one common sense addendum, a very small one, that, you know, one of the reasons I began to understand that I wasn't a part of any system is because, you know, my people, the liberals, will say things like, forgive Africa's debt. The conservatives don't say it. They don't forgive it. And we say forgive it. But I say, what debt? How could Africa owe us anything? I say, we've given them billions. We've stolen, you know, being an American, and you know, and identifying with the Middle East and with Europe, hundreds of trillions of dollars in natural resources and bodies. Today, you can't. Your cell phone won't work if it wasn't for Congo. You know, 7 million people have died in Congo in the last 10 years. It's like this kind of crazy thing. Like, forgive, we owe them. You know, I mean, and it's another way of saying, you know, what you're talking about is we owe them. They don't owe us anything.
Hi. This question is for either of you gentlemen. 40% of Americans consider themselves to be independent, i.e. not registered or aligned with any of the two major parties because they're fed up with the corruption of the two-party system. So I wanted you to speak to that and how you think independence can play a role in this movement that we need.
I'm sorry, because I don't want Howard to think I gave him another tough question, or maybe you think that's an easy question.
No, go ahead.
I am starting this organization. I am starting an organization. I hope to call it Democracy Initiative. We'll see, you know, if there's another organization named that. But I hope to call it that. What I would like to do is, I don't want a third party. I want Americans to fragment and then come together after they fragment. So what you do is you find your own interest, you find your own interest group, you find out what you want to do, you come together with those people, and you learn how to put pressure on the powers that be with whatever level of voting and other political powers that you've garnered through getting together. I want to use all of them. I want to stop the Republicans and the Democrats because they don't represent democracy, they represent oligarchy. But I don't want to be fooled by a third party because, you know, third party, you just buy that party too. You know, say, well, damn, well, yeah, there's more than enough money to go around. With 500 billion, yeah, no more enough to give to, you know, to them, too, if they want to join in the game. But I don't want that. You know, I want.
Well, the 40% of Americans are unaligned. They are not in a party.
Yeah, that's what I mean. But you know, I wouldn't want to. You know, one of the things somebody just said, well, let's start a party that gets those 40%, because think that maybe they were thinking sensibly. But what I want to do, I want people to actually form into many smaller groups. You know, I would love to democratize the House of Representatives, to overthrow them, to make sure that neither the Democrats or the Republicans had more than 49% of the vote. And that would mean that they would have to really talk about some stuff in there. You know, they wouldn't have to say, well, no, man, you got to convince me. And, you know, I come from, you know, Utah, and it's hard to convince me. You know, whatever the people are going to say, but to have it, not to think of a third party. I know you didn't say third party, but I just want to be very clear to say, I don't want, you know, Ralph Nader. I like him, but I don't want Ralph Nader, you know, because, you know, the people underneath him will get bought out too. Anybody can get bought out with the amount of money they have and the amount of power they have.
Well, Walter, can I say something?
Well.
Please.
No. I think it's useful to have a third party, somebody like Ralph Nader, to say things that the other parties won't say, right? To raise issues that they won't raise, to be honest, you know, and third parties can play a very useful role that way. Of course, they're not going to get elected because our political system is not a democratic one, and
Howard Zinn said that.
Yeah, and so the third party is not going to get elected, but the third party can play, you know, a role. But ultimately, and this is where, you know, I agree with you, Walter. Ultimately, it isn't a matter of who's in office. It's a matter of who's sitting outside the office, of who's sitting and who's demonstrating in the streets.
Yeah.
It's a matter of people power.
Yeah.
Because the real issue is, are we going to have a people's movement in this country which is going to rest on the will of all of those people who know that the two-party system is corrupt, who know that the two-party system is not what we want. All these people in this country mobilize their energy and create a social movement which, as in the past, have pushed and pushed and pushed Congress, the President, the Supreme Court into doing what they didn't want to do in the first place. Wherever we have had any changes in the direction of justice in this country have come not from voting for this party or that party, but have come from the people themselves. And I mean, that's a hard thing to grasp because it's easier to go to the polls every 4 years or 4 years and vote. And they want us to think that that's the way. It's harder to work every day to organize and build grassroots movements that will finally create a national movement which will bring about change.
Oh, it's one more question. Okay.
Good afternoon. My question is for you, Mr. Zinn, in regards to social movements, and specifically who and when. Maybe as a young person, it's naive of me to seek answers to such a big question. But where are these new pockets of leadership, not even leadership, but leaderships? Where are these groups of people? Is it acorn workers organizing poultry workers in Mississippi? Is it, you know, public school teachers in our urban schools? Is it educated young professionals trying to go into the political sphere? It's easy to say, you know, this is the way we should do it, but I want to know how. And I'm bursting because I really want to know. And hopefully you can.
Howard, I know she's asked you this question, and I'm going to let you answer, but I just want to say, just to throw one in, Harry Belafonte has a group called The Gathering, where he's had, I think, a dozen meetings of young political activists around the country. It's culminating in a very large meeting in Oakland in the middle of September. I don't know exactly where, but if you Googled The Gathering, you could find it, where that this is definitely a group of people who are moving, you know, and it's also definitely a group of young people working like kind of under the umbrella of Belafonte, but these are people actually doing their own political organizing, and that would be a good one to follow. Howard.
But you know, Walter, there are a lot of grassroots initiatives, just like Harry Belafonte's, that are taking place around the country. Marian Wright Edelman of the Children's Defense Fund She has been organizing, bringing young black people from all over the country to the Alex Haley Center in Tennessee. And there are things happening all over the country that people don't know about. And the problem is, for people to know what people elsewhere are doing, and for them to begin to coordinate. There are actually thousands of groups in this country that are doing things that nobody else knows about. And the problem is to get to know about one another, to make connections with one another in order to build the kind of national movement we need.
Thank you very much for coming. We've been told we have to go.
Folks, the next panel will start in approximately 10 minutes.
Again, we're bringing you live day-long coverage from the Harlem Book Fair in the Schomburg Center in Harlem in New York. The next panel will feature authors Walter Mosley and Howard Zinn. They'll discuss American history, and we'll open our phone lines to get your thoughts after their discussion. A little bit about the fair. The book fair was founded in 1999, and it attracts more readers from the African-American community than any other event in the country. Approximately 50,000 people last year. The stated purpose of the book fair is to spread awareness of literature, culture, and African-American history. Features over 250 exhibit booths, 4 stages, celebrity authors, book selling, storytelling, and a variety of musical entertainment. It's hosted by the Black Book Review, and this year's fair is held again in the Schomburg Center and the County Cullen Libraries on West 135th Street and 5th Avenue to 7th Avenue. Walter Mosley on the left, Howard Zinn on the right on your screen. They'll be discussing African-American history, and we're bringing you live coverage of the Harlem Book Fair here on Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
For a people's history of the United States, 1492 to the present. Fortunate son working on the chain gang, shaking off the dead hand of history. All of those topics and more. Please welcome A History of America, a conversation with Howard Zinn and Walter Mosley.
And we'll open our phone lines to get your thoughts about that panel. Later, a discussion on memoirs and remembrances, including Congressman Charlie Rangel of Harlem and New York's 15th District. Along with him will be journalists Dominique Carter, A.Z. Faison, Yvonne Thornton, and June Cross. And that will be followed by a discussion on writing from an international perspective. After that, a panel on the politics of African-American identity, including W.D. Wright, Gloria J. Brown Marshall, Paul Robeson Jr., and Carol Lee. And the final discussion will be on the evolution of grassroots political thought. Up next, Walter Mosley and Howard Zinn on American history. Howard Zinn, who wrote A People's History of the United States, 1492 to present, joined by Walter Mosley, who authored Devil in a Blue Dress, which was adapted into a movie starring Denzel Washington and Jennifer Beals. This is live coverage of the Harlem Book Fair on Book TV.
Well, we know this. They vote without enthusiasm.
Yeah.
Because what choice do they have? You know.
Yeah.
And, you know, I once saw a bumper sticker that said, if God had intended us to vote, he would have given us candidates. No. So people know this. People know a lot. You see, it's amazing. It's amazing that people know as much as they do, considering the fact that the media, television, newspapers do their best to keep people ignorant. And our educational system doesn't do a lot to give people their real history, and yet people, you know, are intelligent and have common. But the question is, and this is the question you raised, I think, they know these things, and yet very often that knowledge isn't transformed into action. And I think the reason for that is that people very often don't know their own power. And this is where history, they feel helpless. They know these things, but they don't know what to do about it. And it's only at certain points in history that people learn how much power they have. You know, well, I'm thinking of the South, you know, where I lived with my family in the years of the movement, you know, in the late 50s and early 60s. I'm thinking of the South. And black people knew what their lives were like, but it took a while for them to transform that knowledge into this fantastic movement.
And that movement was comprised very greatly of young people, right?
It was.
And that you know, because one of the problems I have today, I'll talk to somebody and I'll say, I'll make a suggestion. I'll say, well, why don't you get this young woman or this young guy to lead your organization? They say, well, they're only 27. And I said, well, you know, that's how Martin Luther King was when they did the boycott.
Yeah.
I said, well, he was different. They don't make people like him anymore. You know, there's that kind of, but that's a self-defeating notion, right? Like and that becomes a part of it. And another thing, like another step beyond that I think is connected to that. I'll say to somebody, they say, well, who are you voting for? And I said, well, you know, who I vote for doesn't matter. How I vote and how I identify myself matters. And then they don't hear that. And they say, well, I like Barack Obama, let's say, you know, or Hillary Clinton or Rudy Giuliani. I don't know who they say, but they say somebody. they say, let's say they say Barack, and they say, I like him. And I said, well, do you know him? Like, and they go, well, yeah, I know what he stands for. I said, well, you thought you knew what Clinton stands for, right? And, you know, I know he lived in Harlem and everything, but you thought you knew that, and you were wrong. And you understand what I'm trying to say? There's a question of there's some knowledge that we believe that we have. That we So here we are, huh? It's very funny, you know, like they kind of put us out on stage, and we met backstage.
They didn't tell us what to do.
No.
No.
But maybe that's good, huh?
Yeah, we don't like to follow orders anyway, do we?
That's right. I don't anyway. I know that. So anyway, I'm going to start. I'm going to ask you a question. There's something I've been working on lately, and it actually started in this room. I was giving a talk, I don't know, like maybe 8 years ago, this auditorium, and I started talking about the vote. And a woman in the audience said very angrily to me that, man, I heard enough about the vote. When are we going to do something? Mm. You know, and I thought, wow, you know, she's right. And so I've been thinking lately. I've been thinking about. Well, there's two things I've been thinking. I've been thinking about starting a website where people can download software in order to identify themselves as a special interest group, and then to find other people who agree with their interests, and then take that from the virtual world to the real world. The reason that I want to do it, and I want to see what you think about this, is it's my understanding that rather than living in a democracy, by default, we're living in a mostly benevolent oligarchy. Mm. What do you think?
Mostly I don't know how benevolent it is. Oligarchy, yes, benevolent? No. But, you know, this business of the vote is really important because we live in a culture, and you can see this by what television emphasizes, what the newspapers emphasize. Everything is built around the vote. Everything is built around who is going to be the next president. Because we all learn, as we're growing up in this country, the most important thing is who is president and who is in Congress. And what we should have learned by now, if we really learned history, or if we just looked around or thought about it, is that the president, Congress, the Supreme Court, they get all the attention. But the fact is, we cannot depend on them to bring about a state of justice and equality in this country. It is up to us. That's why what you're saying about the internet and bringing people together, grassroots groups, making connections, I mean, that's democracy.
Right.
But, you know, you go to junior high school and they teach you what democracy is, and they put on the board the 3 branches of government, and they talk about checks and balances. And no, that's not democracy.
Right. I mean, it's one kind of very bureaucratic, like, wing of democracy, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's, you know, democracy is what people do for themselves. And if you look through history, what you find is that where we've had really serious problems to solve, they haven't been solved by the president or by Congress or by the Supreme Court. The president and Congress and the Supreme Court, they react to the social movements that exist in the country. And so, I mean, slavery was not simply abolished because Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation.
Right,
I mean, exactly. His Emancipation Proclamation came after 30 years of grassroots agitation by black people and some white people, you know, who were creating a great movement. And we've seen that more recently, right? We couldn't depend on even the so-called liberal presidents, Johnson, Kennedy, to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments. And what happened? Black people had to go out in the streets and, you know, all over the South and risk their lives in order to make sure that the 14th and 15th Amendments were finally enforced. Yeah. So, you know, the idea of, they've bamboozled us with the idea of, you know, the voting is the most important thing we can do.
And it's like one thing that you do one day every 4 years or so. And then that there's a lot more to do in between, and there's a lot more to understand. But one of the things, at least for me, that's so confusing, it's a lot of people say, well, they'll come to me and they'll say, well, people don't know this. People don't know that their vote doesn't count, or people don't know that they're being bamboozled, that they're being fooled. But it seems to me like people do know. It seems to me that most people I talk to, and I'm not just talking about New York, you know, because that can get very strange. But even like, you know, like I'll be in the Midwest and I'll be talking, you know, to some, you know, old guy out there, and they'll explain to me how their medical insurance isn't working, how their retirement isn't working, how their children are making the exact same salary that they were making 20 years ago, and so knowledge alone doesn't seem to create enough of an impetus to change things.
Yeah, I think you're right about people knowing. You know, well, you can tell that people know the inadequacy of voting by the fact that half the people in the country don't vote in presidential elections. Why don't they vote? Because they, I think, don't believe that the voting is going to mean anything. And even the 50% of people who do vote